Welcome back to another episode of Content Amplified. Today I'm joined by Zane. Zane, welcome to the show.
Hey, Benjamin, good to talk to you.
Yeah, Zane, I'm excited. This is going to be a fun subject. I think a lot of people are going to relate to it. But before we dive in, let's get to know your background, your work history, and career.
Been doing what I do for about 22 years. Started out in radio in South Africa, then relocated to the US, based in Atlanta, Georgia, for the last 3 years. Worked in radio, as I said, and now sort of moved into something completely different. Work for a care management and home care company with a presence in 38 markets across the country as the content director. And so brand storytelling is really what I do.
I love it. That's so exciting. So we're going to dive into today with brand storytelling, but the kind of angle that we're taking, which is going to be a lot of fun, is balancing the art and science of it. So when you hear that phrase, what does art and science and balancing those two look like when it comes to brand storytelling?
Brand storytelling for me lives at the intersection of meaning and method, right? And what I mean by that is the art is everything that makes you feel. It's the emotion, the language, the characters, the tension, the journey. And for me, it's sort of where creativity thrives, right? Evoking empathy, if you're sparking imagination, creating connection. The science is sort of the behind the scenes. It's the audience insights, data analytics, behavioral research, media strategy. And so it's really what ensures that the creativity isn't just beautiful, but effective. And I think, when those forces come together, that's sort of where brand storytelling becomes powerful, but also persuasive. And you're not just telling a story for story's sake, you're telling the right story in the right way. And of course, to be as efficient as possible to the right person. You obviously know Spotify, right?
Yep, 100%.
And for me, that is such a brilliant example of highly personalized science and emotionally resonant the art. And the timing, of course, sparks massive sharing. They use data to celebrate you as an individual, but create community in the process. And I love that it's personal, it's playful, but for Spotify, it's highly strategic. And that for me is the perfect harmony of when storytelling and data sort of come together. And I think for
I
me,
love that example.
and I think leading with meaning and validating with insight is when you start to really execute with precision.
I love that. That's so cool. And that's such a good example. You're right. Like the relevancy is right there. They're using the data, but the creativity, I love kind of the harmony of that. So
I
when you see brands today, do you kind of see them pushing too much on the data side or too much on the creative side? Or like, what does that kind of look like to you? What are you kind of noticing out there?
I mean, you can feel it in the work when a brand becomes overly data driven. Highly efficient but flat. Decisions are optimized to death, and creativity is diluted by A/B testing. And what remains is often safe, predictable, and emotionally inert, if I may. The brand forgets that people don't fall in love with metrics; they fall in love with meaning. And I think some of the retail emails or the ads we will get, sort of high frequency but low resonance. I'm a big fan of regularly checking my inbox for these emails and unsubscribing to the ones where I'm not getting value. And then on the flip side, when you're too enamored with your creativity, the work can become very indulgent. And in some cases, I think confusing. Do you remember Pepsi did the Kendall Jenner ad in 2017?
Believe so. Yeah.
They were heavy on aesthetic and big idea, but completely tone deaf and disconnected from their audience. And, I think they were trying to be really profound, great, but they skipped the data and the cultural nuance that could have grounded. On the flip side, there's Nike, and Nike uses data to deeply understand its audience, what moves them, what motivates them. And then they're so good at channeling that insight into emotionally compelling stories. You'll remember the You Can't Stop Us campaign from a couple of years ago, which was totally data fueled and insight rich, but wildly creative. And of course, it resonated globally. And I think in anything you do, that's the balance that you should always be aiming for. Now, of course, not everybody has Nike budgets, but I think it's more about the philosophy that they apply that so many brands can look to.
I love that. That's amazing. So, for anyone listening today, and we're hearing these amazing examples and they're thinking through, yeah, that's right. I need to kind of balance those two things. What does that practically look like in your personal approach? when you're in your day to day managing as the creative director, or the director of content, I apologize, as you're doing your day to day work, how do you personally balance those different sides of the art and science? And what does that look like practically day in and day out?
I mean, for me, I always start, whether it's a campaign or a story arc, what does the audience feel right? And what do I want them to do next? Right? So those two questions, I think, for me, are always sort of the critical starting points. And that gives you the emotional starting point, but also the business objective, and again, the art and the science. And so from there, it's about layering insight and creativity and sort of building a fire with both spark, but also structure. And for me, the science is about where the audience is at. What do they need? How are they behaving? And the art is how we talk to them. It's the tone, it's the story, it's the brand. In my work at Erosa, we do one of the big things we need to do is we need to build trust with families going through, in some cases, the hardest decision they'll make, getting help for an aging parent. And the science gives us the entry point. What is the insight there? It's fear, guilt, overwhelm. The art is crafting stories that then can provide comfort, hope, and peace of mind. And I think we like to use real voices from our care managers. We like to use client stories from families and build campaigns that sound like reassurance and not just a sales pitch. And I think, when you carry that, and I always try and carry that balance, whether I was in media or I'm in home care, I think that there's no one size fits all. And I think when you get it right, this is a little cliche I quite like. When you go from brand engagement to brand belief, and I think that's a very important transition in the customer journey in making a decision whether you're going to purchase or not.
I like that phrase. That's going to be our little snippet at the beginning of this episode. I love it. That's great. So I'm going to throw you a little curveball. When you're looking at brand storytelling and the art and science, for you and from what you've seen out there in the industry, does it start with the art or does it start with the science or does sometimes it start with one or the other? What are your thoughts there?
Great question. I think it's a little bit of both, and it also depends on the individual brand and the business objective. We've been speaking a lot about how it can be too beautiful and not achieve the objective. And sometimes when the objective's too hard. And that's why I think, if you're a very functional brand and you need to soften up, perhaps you start with the art and then go to the science. Or if you're a very whimsical brand and your storytelling hasn't been very clear and you need a bit of clarity in your rollout, start with the science. I mean, I guess it depends.
I like it. And when you're looking at like headcount and personnel for your team, are you finding that you need multiple people, someone who's more on the creative side and someone who's more on the analytics side or the data side? Or have you found what I would probably call unicorns that are able to manage both sides of the branding coin?
You just took the word right out of my mouth. I mean, these unicorns are becoming more prevalent, actually. We recently hired a digital marketing manager who was supposed to be more focused on digital media, but she's incredibly creative and her ability to design, to write is so strong. And so it's really been quite interesting to see how the art and the science is now not in individual departments anymore, but it's all coming together in a unified team. And so we have a really tiny marketing team. So being efficient and being sort of both an artist and a scientist is really important. And I think if you find the right people for your team, they'll have those skills.
I love that. So, what advice would you have for anyone in their marketing career, regardless of what stage, of how to become a better marketing? And I love the phrases. I'm going to take these right out of your mouth. The marketing scientist and the marketing artist. How do we develop maybe some of our weaknesses in these points so that we can become more of a unicorn marketer when it comes to that whole situation?
I think it starts with curiosity, true curiosity, understanding what you know, more importantly, understanding what you do not know, and then learning about it, and then asking questions and trying things and making mistakes. My philosophy is always, let's aim to get it right 80% of the time, and let's give ourselves 20% to experiment and to try and to fail and to try again. I don't think that anyone knows everything about marketing at different intersections of their careers. Because if you think about how AI has just revolutionized marketing in the last maybe just call it 3, but it's not even 5 years. And what's to come? I mean, Bill Gates recently said that AI was going to be replacing teachers. I was like, what? That sounded ridiculous. If you told me that 3 years ago, I would have said there's no way. Today I'm going, well, maybe Bill Gates isn't too far off.
I think that's fascinating. I love it. So, from all of the brands that you've seen and all of the insights you have, what's some advice of maybe some things that we should stop doing when it comes to our storytelling? Any pieces of advice where you're like, hey, you might want to cut that out a little bit. That'll help you tell your story a little bit better.
I think brands, we've spoken about some great brands, but some brands tend to treat storytelling like a press release with 2 pretty pictures. And too many are still defaulting to corporate jargon. And sometimes on TikTok, there's overly polished videos or templated messages that lack heart. The audience feels when it's manufactured. And I think in a world where attention is so scarce and trust is very fragile, manufactured just for me doesn't cut it. And I think the other trap is assuming storytelling has to always be big and bold and cinematic to be effective. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the quiet ones. In our case, a caregiver describing their morning routine with a client, or a user sharing how products change their life. If it's real and human, I think it has an impact. So yeah, one pet peeve that I have to talk about is, and this comes from my radio days as well, working with radio presenters. Sometimes they've got the big voice and they're announcing. I'd say stop telling stories that talk at people. Start listening more, inviting your audience into your narrative, and don't make it feel like it's a brand performance, but make it feel like it's a shared moment. Again, some of those brands we spoke about, Nike in particular, you feel that story. You kind of see yourself in those shoes. And I think if it's truly authentic, and one of the brands we haven't mentioned that just popped into my head is Patagonia, right? They've built loyalty not because they're always flashy, and they are, but because they're authentic. And I think when your actions match your words, your stories will reflect those values to your audience. And I think that's the kind of storytelling that really sticks.
Okay, I love that. Again, a ton of quotes. So now I have to debate between which one of those I use at the beginning. So thanks for making my job hard. I love that.
Sorry.
One final question, and this is another curveball. I apologize.
Well, good.
What are some of the best formats that you've seen for telling these authentic stories? Because I really love how you talked about sometimes the stories can be big, sometimes they're small and subtle. And I love the authenticity. It's not overly polished, it's organic, it's having a listening moment and giving someone else the microphone, so to speak. Are there any really good formats today that have been working really well for you to kind of tell these stories and have those moments with the audience?
Yeah. Video. We're seeing on average between 35 and 40% higher engagement on video content across platform. The only platform where we're seeing, and this is all digital, obviously, LinkedIn, we sort of see static images still works fairly well, but the meta platforms, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, video is the new document. And if you're not playing in that space, your brand's going to fall behind. But in saying that, it's not about making just a single video. We've recently started to, we sort of map out our content for a month, and then we plot it on each platform individually. So Facebook has its own vertical, Instagram has its own vertical, TikTok has its own vertical, because you've got to understand the platform where you're telling the story on. And so these platforms, even though we might think they all work in the same way, there's certain nuances that are going to work on one that's not going to work on the other. And so it's really important to understand the platform that you're playing on, and how the audience consumes that. And so again, using the science there to then build the art.
I love that. That's amazing. Well, Zane, thank you. We have run out of time, but if anyone listening today wants to connect with you online, how and where can they find you?
The best way to find me is probably just on LinkedIn. Just search for Zane Derbyshire. I know the name is a mouthful, but Zane is pretty easy, Zane. And Derbyshire, like the county in England.
Very cool. I love it. And for anyone listening, we will actually link to Zane's LinkedIn profile in the show notes. So you just have to look there and click and connect with him. Zane, thank you. I really do appreciate the time and effort today.
Thank you, Benjamin.